The story begins not with a house, but with a sound, the rhythmic and mechanical clicking of a repeating rifle being loaded in the quiet air of a New England afternoon, a sound that represented the turning of a massive gear in the machinery of American history. As the Winchester family wealth grew from the cold iron and polished wooden invention that changed the landscape of the world forever, every dollar earned was a heavy coin added to a pile that shimmered with both prestige and a lingering sense of profound sorrow. The fortune was vast and sprawling like the valleys of the West, and yet it carried a weight that no amount of gold could ever truly lighten. Imagine the soft rustle of Victorian silk and the heavy velvet curtains of a New Haven mansion, where the air was thick with the scent of expensive tobacco and rose water. Here the wealth was a tangible thing felt in the smooth surfaces of mahogany tables and the ticking of grandfather clocks that measured time in a way that felt eternal. But behind the elegance was the shadow of the factory smoke and the relentless fire of the forge. The repeating rifle was known as the gun that won the West, but to Sarah Winchester, it became a symbol of a debt that could never be fully repaid. As she sat in the quiet rooms of her early life, the silence seemed to echo with the distant thunder of history. She was a woman of small stature, but immense intellect, surrounded by the finest things the 19th century could provide. Yet the wealth felt like a gilded cage that grew tighter with every passing year. The golden sun would set over the Connecticut hills, casting long and spindly shadows across the manicured lawns, and she would wonder about the lives touched by the steel her family produced. The money flowed in like a rising tide, deep and unstoppable, filling the banks and the coffers until there was nothing left to buy but time and perhaps a sense of peace that remained forever out of reach. It is said that every great fortune hides a secret, and the Winchester secret was written in the ledger of spirits that supposedly followed the trail of the silver bullet. She lived in a world of lace and high society, but her mind was often drifting toward a horizon where the Industrial Revolution met the mystical unknown. The repeating rifle was a marvel of engineering, a masterpiece of precision and cold logic, but the consequences of its success were chaotic and unpredictable. As the years turned into decades, the wealth became a mountain, and Sarah stood at the peak looking down into a mist that refused to clear. She felt the eyes of the past watching from the corners of dimly lit parlors and heard the whispers of legacy that demanded an architectural penance. The shadow was not a dark cloud, but a subtle thinning of the light, a feeling that the walls were too thin and the world was too loud. She began to envision a place where construction would never end, a sanctuary of wood and nail that could house the restless energy of 1,000 stories. The clinking of the coins became the tapping of hammers in her mind, creating a rhythm that was both a lullaby and a warning. The vastness of the American plains was mirrored in the vastness of her bank account, and both felt equally lonely under the vast and starlit sky. She sought comfort in the idea of perpetual motion, believing that if the saws continued to wind and the wood continued to be plain, the shadows would stay at bay. The repeating rifle had carved a path through wilderness, and now Sarah would carve a path through the architecture of her own grief. The wealth allowed her to build a labyrinth of dreams where doors opened in nowhere and windows looked out onto walls of brick. It was a manifestation of mind trying to outrun a ghost that was made of gold and lead. The air in the house would be still and cool, smelling of fresh redwood and old memories as the sun moved slowly across the ornate ceilings. There was no rush. In this world of endless building, only the steady flow of time and the quiet accumulation of rooms that served no purpose other than to exist. The heavy draperies muffled the sounds of the outside world, leaving only the heartbeat of the house itself, a slow and steady thrum that promised a sleep without end. The shadows of the rifles were replaced by the shadows of the rafters, and the dark history was woven into the very insulation of the walls. She was a weaver of wood and a collector of silence, using her massive fortune to buy a different kind of reality. The repeating rifle had been a tool of fast action, but her house was a monument to slow deliberation. Every corner was a turn in a story that had no ending, and every floorboard was a sentence in a book that would never be closed. The wealth was the ink and the land was the paper, and Sarah Winchester wrote a masterpiece of confusion and beauty that eventually settled into quiet dust of San Jose. The American landscape drifted past the windows of her soul like a slow-moving river, and she found her rest in the middle of a construction site that felt like a cathedral. The hammers are silent now, but the echo of the fortune remains in the air like the smell of ozone after a storm. The repeating rifle is a museum piece, but the house is a living memory of a woman who tried to build a bridge between the world of the living and the world of the shadows. The money is gone and the family is a footnote, but the mystery of the architecture continues to breathe in the cool night air. The gold has turned to brass and the silk has turned to threadbare memories, but the story of the Winchester wealth is still told in the creak of the stairs and the sigh of the wind through the skylights. It is a long and winding road to the history of a family that had everything, and yet sought only a place to hide. The darkness is not a frightening thing, but a soft blanket that covers the errors of the past, and the rifles are put away in boxes of velvet and dust. The repeating sound of the mechanism is replaced by the repeating sound of heart at rest, and the vast fortune is finally spent on the luxury of a quiet mind. The sun has fully set now, and the house is a silhouette against the purple sky, a giant puzzle that no one needs to solve. The shadow of the rifle is long, but the night is longer, and eventually all the stories merge into the same deep and heavy silence that precedes a perfect sleep. The story narrows its focus now to the quiet halls of memory where the air is soft and the light is always dim. We find Sarah sitting in a chair of carved oak as she watches the dust motes dance in a single beam of afternoon sun. The silence of the house is not empty, but filled with the weight of things gone by. First, there was a tiny heartbeat, her daughter Annie, whose life was like a flicker of a candle in a vast and drafty room. The loss of the child is a quietness that settles into the bones, and Sarah carried this stillness with her through every corridor of her life. She would touch the empty cradle and feel the coldness of the wood, and the world seemed to slow down until every second felt like an hour. Then came the passing of William, her husband, and the anchor of her world, whose departure left her drifting on an ocean of black ink. The Winchester name was heavy with gold, but her heart was heavy with a leaden sorrow that no amount of luxury could ever wash away. She walked through the rooms of their New Haven home and heard the phantom echo of footsteps that would never return. The grief was a physical presence, a shadow that sat at the dinner table and slept in the guest room. It was a slow and steady rain that never stopped falling on the roof of her soul. She sought answers in the rustle of autumn leaves and the way the fog rolled over the hills of Connecticut. She became a traveler in the land of morning where the maps are made of tears and the landmarks are all memories of smiles that have faded into the gray. The wealth that surrounded her felt like a distant mountain range, beautiful but cold and unreachable in her time of need. She began to see the world through a veil of black lace where the colors were muted and the sounds were all softened as if the entire universe was being wrapped in cotton wool. She remembered the smell of his pipe tobacco and the way the light caught the gold of her wedding band, which now felt like a heavy shackle of iron. There was a profound loneliness in being a keeper of so much history and so much pain. She would sit for hours staring at the fireplace where the embers glowed like dying stars, and she would imagine the life that might have been if the shadows had not been so long. The repeating rifles had brought them a fortune, but they could not buy a single extra breath of those she loved most. She felt as though she were walking through a house where all the doors had been locked from the outside, and she was searching for a key that had been thrown into the deep blue sea. Her grief was not a sharp scream, but a low and constant hum like the sound of a beehive in the heat of summer. It was a dull ache that synchronized with the ticking of the clocks and the slow rotation of the earth. She decided that if she could not have the life she planned, she would build a life that no one could understand. She left the East Coast behind, carrying her boxes of mourning clothes and her trunks filled with the silence of her losses. The train ride across the American continent was a long and steady vibration, a mechanical lullaby that carried her further away from the graves and closer to a new kind of haunting. She watched the prairies go by through the glass and saw her own reflection looking back, a woman who was becoming a ghost while still breathing. The loss of Annie and William had stripped away her layers until only the core of her remained a quiet and flickering flame in the dark. She arrived in California, where the air was warm and smelled of salt and citrus, but the coldness stayed inside her, hidden behind her black veils. She bought the farmhouse not to live in it, but to lose herself within its walls, to create a physical version of the labyrinth that was her mind. Every new room she added was a tribute to a moment she couldn't get back, and every winding hallway was a path she took to avoid the memory of the end. She lived in a state of perpetual evening where the sun was always just below the horizon, and the stars were always just about to appear. The grief turned into architecture, and the sorrow turned into wood and stone. She was a widow of the world, a mother of shadows, and a builder of dreams that were meant to keep the spirits occupied, so they wouldn't see her cry in the dark. The hammers began their work of rhythmic tapping that matched the heartbeat she used to listen for in the nursery. Tap, tap, tap went the wood, and sigh, sigh, sigh went the wind through the eaves of the growing mansion. She found a strange comfort in the chaos of construction, because as long as the house was changing, she didn't have to face the fact that her life had stopped. She was a soul adrift in a sea of redwood and stained glass, sailing toward a destination that didn't exist. The wealth was now a tool for distraction, a way to buy more time and more space to hide the heavy burden of her heart. She would walk to the unfinished rooms at midnight, smelling the sawdust and the pine, feeling the roughness of the raw timber against her palms. The house was a living thing, growing larger and stranger every day, reflecting the complexity of a woman who had lost everything that mattered and gained everything she didn't want. The darkness was her friend, and the silence was her sister, and the two of them walked hand in hand to the corridors that led nowhere. The loss was the foundation of the house, and the grief was a mortar between the bricks, and the result was a monument to the endurance of a human spirit that refuses to break even when it is bent into 1,000 different shapes. She was a lady in black, a mystery wrapped in a legend, living in a house of 1,000 doors, all which led back to the same quiet room in her heart, where Annie and William were still waiting for her in a golden light, a New England afternoon that would never end. Sleep now comes like a fog over the San Jose Valley, thick and cool, and erasing the edges of the world, until there is only the sound of the breathing house and a memory of a love that was stronger than death. The stories are over, and the light is gone, and the rest is just a long and steady peace of the night. The turning point arrived like a slow-moving storm front across a flat and silent prairie, bringing with it a change in the wind that Sarah Winchester felt in the very marrow of her bones as she sat in the velvet shadows of Boston parlor, seeking a bridge to beyond. The air in the medium room was heavy with the scent of dried lavender and old books, and the dim light of a single flickering candle cast long and spindly shadows that danced across the wallpaper like reaching fingers. The psychic sat across from her with eyes closed and a voice that sounded like the rustle of dry parchment paper whispering a truth that would alter the course of Sarah's life forever. "You are haunted," the voice said, and the words hung in the air like heavy smoke from a distant fire. "The spirits of those who fell by the Winchester rifle are seeking their due, and they follow you like a trail of silent shadows through the corridors of your mind and the rooms of your empty house." Imagine the chill that settled over her as the logic of the spiritualist world began to weave itself into the fabric of her reality, creating a pattern of fear and purpose that was as intricate as a spiderweb. The medium spoke of a debt of blood and a fortune built on the echoes of gunfire, and told her that she must leave her home in the east and travel toward the setting sun to build a sanctuary that would never be finished. "As long as the hammers are falling," the voice whispered, "you shall live, but if the work ever stops, the spirits will find their way to your door." This was the prophecy that became the heartbeat of her existence, a rhythmic command that hummed in the background of every thought as she boarded the train for California. The wheels of the locomotive clicked against the iron rails in a steady hypnotic cadence, saying build and build and build until the sound became a lullaby for her restless soul. She looked out the window at the vast American landscape, watching the trees blur into a green mist and the mountains rise like sleeping giants against the purple sky. She felt the invisible weight of 1,000 stories pressing against the glass, each spirit a quiet passenger on her journey to the west. When she reached the warm valley of San Jose, the air was thick with the smell of sun-ripened fruit, and the golden light felt like a healing balm, but the prophecy remained tucked inside her heart, like a folded letter that she read over and over again. She found a modest farmhouse and saw not a home, but a canvas for an endless architectural prayer place where she could outrun the shadows by, creating a labyrinth of wood and nails. Every door she planned and every window she placed was a move in a grand game of chess against the unseen visitors who supposedly walked beside her. The wealth she carried was no longer a burden of guilt, but the fuel for a monumental machine of construction that would churn for 38 years without a moment of true silence. The spirits were her guides and her tormentors, and her constant companions in the quiet hours of the night when she would sit in her seance room and listen to house breathing around her. She imagined them standing in the corners of the unfinished ballrooms and peeking to the skylights that looked down into empty hallways. She gave them rooms they could never leave and stairs they could never climb, building a world of confusion to keep herself safe in the center of the maze. The tapping of the hammers became a comforting sound, like the steady drip of rain on a tin roof or the ticking of a clock that never needs winding. It was a boring and beautiful repetition, a cycle of creation that pushed back the darkness one board at a time. The psychic's words were the blueprint for a life lived in a state of perpetual motion, where there was no time for the finality of an ending and no space for the silence of a finished wall. Sarah moved through the house like a shadow herself, her black silk dress whispering against the redwood floors as she directed the workmen to tear down what they had built yesterday and start something new today. The logic of the world outside fell away, replaced by a dreamlike sequence of blueprints and belfries, where the only thing that mattered was a continuation of the work. The sun would rise over the mountains and find the carpenters already at their posts, and the sun would set over the ocean and find Sarah still sketching her visions in the flickering lamplight. It was a long and winding road of a story with no period at the end, only a comma that led to another room and another hallway and another flight of stairs. The spirits were satisfied by the noise and the chaos, and Sarah was satisfied by the safety of the constant change. The prophecy was a heavy mantle, but it gave her a reason to keep moving when the grief of her past threatened to pull her under the waves. She was the architect of her own survival, building a fortress of redwood and glass that would stand as a monument to a single moment of supernatural advice. The air in the valley was still, and the stars were bright, and the house grew larger and stranger under the watchful eye of the moon. It was a masterpiece of the mundane and the mysterious of place, where the boring task of driving a nail into a board became a sacred act of protection. And so the hammers continued their rhythmic dance, and the saws continued their low whine, and Sarah Winchester drifted into a long and dreamless sleep within the heart of the labyrinth she had created to save her soul. The night is long and the work is steady, and the rest is silence. The central myth began to pulse through the foundations of the house, like a slow and steady heartbeat that never skipped a beat even in the deepest hours of the moonlit night, when the rest of the world was tucked away in blankets and silence. Sarah Winchester lived by a singular and haunting rhythm that dictated the very air she breathed and the way she walked through her ever-expanding corridors. The belief was as solid as the redwood beams and as persistent as the California fog that she would only remain on this side of the veil as long as the sound of construction echoed to the eaves of her home. Imagine the constant and soothing drone of 1,000 hammers falling in a distant and muffled synchronization, creating a sonic blanket that wrapped around the mansion and kept the silence of the grave at bay. For 38 years the air was thick with the scent of fresh sawdust and the rhythmic scraping of trowels against brick, as if the house itself were a living, breathing organism that needed to grow in order to survive. She believed that if the hammers ever fell silent, the spirits of fallen would find the quiet gap in the air and slip through to claim her soul. So she transformed her vast fortune into a shield of constant motion, a perpetual machinery of wood and nail that turned her life into a long and winding story with no final chapter. The workmen labored in shifts throughout the day, and the night their movements becoming a boring and predictable dance of progress that led nowhere in particular, but everywhere at once. A room would be built only to be torn down and replaced by a hallway that ended in a sheer drop, or a window that looked out into another room, because the purpose was not the destination, but the journey of the building itself. She would sit in her chair and listen to the vibration of the saws and the steady thud of the mallets, feeling a sense of deep and heavy security in the noise that most would find maddening. It was a lullaby of industry and mechanical prayer that rose up to the rafters and settled into the insulation of the walls. The myth grew taller than the towers of the house, stretching into the folklore of the valley until the name Winchester became synonymous with a woman who outran death with a carpenter's square. She moved through the labyrinth like a ghost, entraining her footsteps silenced by the thick carpets, while cacophony of construction provided the background music for her reclusive life. Every nail driven into the cedar was a second added to her clock, and every board planed smooth was a day she snatched away from the inevitable end. The sun would cast long and shifting shadows through the stained glass windows, creating patterns on the floor that looked like maps of a world that only she understood. The house became a physical manifestation of a heartbeat that refused to stop, a sprawling complex, 160 rooms that whispered of a pact made between a widow and the wind. The heavy velvet curtains muffled the outside world, but they could not dampen the inner sound of hammers, which Sarah heard even in her dreams as a steady and comforting presence. It was a boring and repetitive existence, but in that repetition there was a profound peace that allowed her to drift through the decades without the fear of final bell tolling for her. She saw herself as a conductor of grand and endless symphony of construction, where the instruments were made of steel and timber, and the music was the sound of a house that refused to be finished. The neighbors would hear the distant tapping from across the orchards, and know that the lady was still there weaving her web of architecture to trap the spirits in a maze of her own making. She lived in the gaps between the sounds, finding her rest in the very middle of the chaos, because the chaos meant life, and the silence meant the end. The myth was the mortar that held the bricks together, and the belief was the glass in the windows reflecting a reality where time was measured in board feet, and the ticking of the clock was replaced by the falling of the hammer. She was a woman caught in a loop of creation and destruction, a cycle that felt as natural as the turning of the tides or the changing of the seasons. The air in the house was always moving, carrying the dust of the work from one wing to another, as if the mansion were exhaling the old and inhaling the new. She would walk to the unfinished ballrooms at 3 a.m. and feel the presence of the workmen, who were just shadows in the candlelight, their hammers rising and falling in a slow and hypnotic motion that promised another day of existence. The wealth was being converted into a shield of redwood, and as the years turned into decades, the shield grew thicker and more complex, until it was a world unto itself. The story of Sarah Winchester is a story of a woman who built a cage for her fears and found that the cage was the only place she felt free. The hammer is a heartbeat, and the saws of the breath in the house is the body that keeps the soul from wandering away into the dark. And as you listen to the imagined sound of those distant hammers, let your own breath fall into that same steady rhythm, slow and heavy and predictable. The work is never done, but the work is what brings the quiet, and the quiet is what brings the sleep that settles over the valley like a heavy velvet cloak. The myth is just a story we tell to explain the mystery of a house that never wanted to be a home, but as long as the story continues, the light stays on in the window and the shadows stay outside the door. The night is long and the hammers are soft, and the rest is just the beginning of a dream that has no end. The journey across the great expanse of the American continent was a long and rhythmic vibration that carried Sarah Winchester away from the cold gray winters of New England toward the golden promise of the Santa Clara Valley, where the air was warm and smelled of sun-drenched earth and ripening fruit. She arrived in California in 1884 as a woman of quiet determination, stepping off the train into a world that felt bright and vastly different from the shadowed parlors she had left. Behind in the wake of her grief, the sun was a constant and heavy presence in the sky, casting long and sharp shadows across the dirt roads as she traveled to her small and unassuming property that would change the landscape of her life and the history of the valley forever. It was a simple 8-room farmhouse, sitting amidst a sea of apricot and prune orchards, a modest structure of wood and glass that seemed to blink in the harsh California light. She looked at the simple lines of the house and saw not a finished dwelling, but a seed that was waiting to be planted in the soil of her restless imagination. She purchased the land with the quiet confidence of a woman who possessed the infinite resources of the Winchester fortune, and the moment the deed was signed, the air seemed to hum with the first faint echoes of construction that would not cease for decades to ever follow. She moved through the original 8 rooms and touched the walls, feeling the potential for expansion and the necessity for change, as if the house were a blank page upon which she would write a story of wood and stone and mystery. There was a profound and boring stillness to those early days as she began to hire local carpenters and craftsmen who arrived with their heavy toolboxes and their simple plans, not knowing they were joining a project that would outlast many of their own lives. The first hammers fell in a steady and predictable cadence, a soft tapping that blended with the sound of the wind through the orchard leaves, creating a hypnotic atmosphere that settled over property like a layer of fine dust. She began to add a room here and a hallway there, extending the reach of the house toward the horizon, as if she were trying to catch the setting sun before it disappeared behind the Santa Cruz Mountains. The farmhouse began to lose its original shape, becoming a sprawling and eccentric creature that stretched its wings over the landscape with every passing month and every passing year. It was a slow and methodical transformation, a boringly repetitive process of building and rebuilding that mirrored the steady rotation of the earth and the slow growth of the trees surrounding her. She would walk through the newly framed skeletons of rooms, smelling the sharp scent of fresh redwood and the dry aroma of sawdust that coated every surface in a soft and pale blanket. The original 8 rooms were soon buried deep within the heart of a growing labyrinth, swallowed up by the complexity of her vision and the relentless drive to keep the hammers falling at all hours of the day and night. The house began to develop a mind of its own, a series of twisting passages and strange corners that defied the traditional logic of architecture and replaced it with the logic of a dream that never reaches its conclusion. She sat in her small temporary quarters, watching the blueprints pile up on her desk, each one more intricate than the last map of a house that was becoming a city. Of one, the local residents would pass by the gates and see the scaffolding rising higher and higher against the blue sky, wondering at the purpose of such a monumental effort. But Sarah remained hidden behind her veils, focused entirely on the rhythmic progress of the work. The farmhouse was no longer a farmhouse, but a manifestation of her internal world of place, where she could wander for miles without ever leaving the safety of her own walls. The sun would rise over the orchards and find a new tower reaching toward the clouds, and the sun would set over the Pacific and find a new wing being added to the western edge of the estate. It was a boring and beautiful cycle of growth that required no explanation other than the need to keep moving and the need to keep the silence at bay. The air in the house was always cool, and still, even as the hammers continued their distant end, muffled thumping in the far-off corners of the mansion, she found a strange and heavy peace in the predictability of the construction, the way the wood met the nail, and the way the glass fit into frame, creating a world of tangible objects that she could control in a life that had been defined by loss. The farmhouse was the foundation of a mystery that would grow into 160 rooms, each one a different note in a long and winding song of survival. She was a pioneer of the spirit, building a fortress of redwood in a valley of gold, and as the years turned the pages of history, the house grew into a legend that whispered to the stars. The night is now deep and the orchards are silent, but the memory of those first 8 rooms remains at the center of the maze like a heart that continues to beat in the stillness of the dark. The hammers are quiet in your mind, and the house is at rest, and the long journey from the east has finally found its quiet and eternal home in the soft California night. The house began to speak a language of beautiful and quiet absurdity as the architecture drifted away from the shores of reason and sailed into a sea of endless wood and strange geometry, where every corner turned was a riddle and every room was a question without an answer. Imagine walking through a hallway where the floor is polished to a mirror finish, and the air is perfectly still and cool against your skin as you approach a grand staircase built of heavy oak and fine redwood, only to look up and see the steps rising higher and higher until they terminate abruptly against a solid plaster ceiling with no opening and no destination. It is a staircase to nowhere, a vertical path for the mind to wander, while the body remains anchored in the silence of a house that refuses to follow the rules of the world outside. Sarah designed these anomalies was slow and methodical, intent believing that the spirits who followed the center of fortune would find themselves caught in these architectural loops, drifting up stairs that lead to nothing, and walking through doors that open onto walls of brick or 30-foot drops into the garden below. It was a boring and repetitive game of hide and seek played across 160 rooms, where a window might be placed in the floor to look down into a kitchen, or a chimney might stop short of the roof to vent into a closet. She sat in the center of this sprawling puzzle and felt a sense of heavy safety, knowing that the logic of the maze was her own and confusion of the ghosts was her protection. The air in these strange spaces is thick with the smell of old cedar and the faint humming of the wind as it passes through the skylights that peer into internal rooms where the sun never truly reaches. She built cupboards that are only an inch deep and hallways that narrow until they are nothing but a memory of a passage, creating a landscape that is as dreamlike and predictable as the coming of the tide. The carpenter's wood. Drive nails into wood with a rhythmic thud, 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 creating a sonic wallpaper that allowed Sarah to drift into a deep and heavy state of contemplation, while the house grew around her like a living forest of rafters and joists. There are doors that open onto the abyss and panels that hide secret passages where she could vanish from one wing and appear in another, as if she were a shadow moving through the very bones of the building. Every anomaly was a sentence in a long and winding story that never reached a period, but only continued with more commas and more turns until the mind becomes tired and ready for the soft embrace of the dark. The spirits would supposedly wander these dead ends and blind alleys, their ethereal footsteps echoing against the redwood as they searched for the woman who built a cage of confusion to keep them at bay. She was a master of the mundane and the mysterious, turning the boring task of building a home into an epic journey of misdirection and quiet. Beauty where the numbers 13 and the patterns of spider webs were woven into the very fabric of the glass and the stone. The house is a monument to the idea that nothing is ever truly finished, and that a staircase can be a place of rest even if it leads to the ceiling, because it is the act of climbing that matters, not the reaching of the top. The heavy velvet drapes muffle the sounds of the San Jose Valley, leaving only the internal pulse of the mansion and the soft creaking of the wood as It settles under the weight of its own complexity. You can feel the weight of the house pressing down like a warm blanket as you imagine walking these halls where the rules of gravity and direction are gently set aside in favor of a long and steady peace. The doors that lead nowhere are just invitations to stay exactly where you are, and the stairs to the ceiling are just a reminder that there is no rush to get anywhere at all in this world of redwood and shadow. The light fades from the skylights and the house settles into a deep and rhythmic breathing, and the anomalies become just quiet features of a landscape designed for a long and dreamless sleep. The hammers have stopped in the distant wings, and the silence is a heavy and comforting presence that fills the gaps between the walls and the secrets of the mansion. Sleep now as you wander the labyrinth of a house that was built to lose the world and find the quiet heart of the night. The architectural logic of the Winchester mansion drifts away from the terrestrial world, like a slow-moving ship entering a fog where gravity is merely a suggestion, and the structural integrity of a dream takes precedence over the cold, hard rules of engineering. As you walk the quietude of the corridors, you see columns installed upside down with their heavy bases touching the ceiling, and their delicate capitals resting on the floor, as if the house itself were trying to stand on its head, to peer into another dimension. There are windows built into the floor that look down into the darkness of rooms below, and skylights that are covered by the floors of the levels above them, creating layers of glass, and would that trap the light in a repetitive and boring cycle of reflections. Sarah Winchester moved through this gravity-defying landscape with steady and rhythmic grace, her mind tuned to a frequency that only the wood and the stone could hear. She commissioned balconies that open into the interior of ballrooms and trapdoors that lead to kitchens 4 stories down, as if she were folding the very fabric of space to create a sanctuary that defied the tracking of any mortal or spectral visitor. The air in these rooms is heavy and still smelling of centuries-old redwood, and the faint metallic tang of the copper pipes that snake through the walls like the veins of a sleeping giant. Imagine the slow and methodical process of a builder placing a door on the second floor that opens directly into the empty air of the garden below, a threshold between the safety of the house and the pull of the earth, where the only thing to greet the foot is the soft sigh of the California wind. These design choices fuel the reputation of a house haunted not just by spirits, but by the very idea of impossibility, where the straight line is a stranger and the circle is the only path forward. The repetitive nature of the construction meant that the house was constantly swallowing itself and being reborn in a new and more confusing shape, a boringly beautiful evolution of architectural defiance that challenges the modern mind to let go of its need for order. The weights and pulleys of the hidden elevators hum a low and vibrating frequency that lulls the senses into a state of deep relaxation as they move through the vertical labyrinth of the mansion. She believed that by challenging the physics of the world, she could create a pocket of reality where time did stocks and the shadows could be managed by the sheer complexity of the layout. The pillars and the rafters intersect at angles that suggest a geometry not found in textbooks, a slow and winding logic that mirrors the way a mind wanders before falling into a deep sleep. The house is a monument to the idea that a wall does not have to be a barrier, and a floor does not have to be a foundation, but rather they are just pieces of a puzzle that can be rearranged at the whim of a widow who sought to confuse the very forces of nature. The sound of the hammers in the distance is a muffled thud, 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 like a heartbeat in a pillow, providing a steady and unchanging backdrop to the silence of the grand halls. You can almost feel the house shifting its weight as the redwood settles into the soil and the glass panes hum with the distant vibration of the sea. The reputation of the house as a supernatural vortex is built upon these physical contradictions, the way a staircase might twist like a ribbon only to end as solid wall of bricks, or how a chimney might be built with such a narrow flue that only a ghost could pass through it. It is a boring and repetitive landscape of wonders where the eye grows tired of searching for a reason, and the heart finds comfort in the lack of a destination. The gravity of the world outside is replaced by the levity of a house that dreams of flying even as it is anchored by millions of pounds of stone and timber. Sarah sat in her quiet rooms and watched the shadows play against the upside-down pillars, feeling a sense of profound and heavy peace in the knowledge that her house was a place where the impossible was simply the daily routine. The night is long and the logic is soft, and the house continues to defy the earth in a slow and rhythmic dance of architecture and mystery. Let your thoughts drift through the skylights that lead to nowhere and down the stairs that stop at the ceiling as the heavy velvet curtains of sleep draw close over windows of your mind. The house is still, and the World is far away, and the only thing that remains is a steady and comforting pulse of a mansion that exists between the earth and the stars. The rest is silence and the gravity of your own breath leading you into the dark. The number 13 begins to appear in the quiet corners of the house like a repetitive and rhythmic whisper that flows through the redwood veins of the mansion and settles into the very marrow of the architecture, creating a boring and beautiful pattern that guides the eye and lulls the mind into a state of deep and heavy contemplation. As you walk through the silent halls where the air is cool, and still you begin to notice the steady and predictable recurrence of this singular digit, manifesting in the most mundane and extraordinary details of Sarah's creation. Imagine looking up at the ornate ceiling panels in the grand ballrooms where the wood is carved into intricate geometric shapes and finding that every section is divided into exactly 13 distinct segments forming a hypnotic canopy that stretches over your head like a starlit sky made of timber and shadow. The number is not a warning, but a signature, a rhythmic pulse that Sarah wove into the fabric of her reality. To perhaps harmonize with the unseen world, or to create a secret language that only the walls could speak, you move to the windows where the famous Tiffany glass catches the golden California light, and you count the panes of shimmering glass only to find 13 colorful jewels set into the leaden frames, creating a repetitive glow that washes over the floorboards in a soft and steady sequence of hues. Even in the most functional parts of the house, the number remains a constant and boringly reliable companion as you lean over the white porcelain sinks in the many bathrooms and count the drainage holes arranged in a perfect circle of 13 small dark eyes that watch the water swirl away into the hidden plumbing of the mansion. The repetition of the number acts like a mechanical heartbeat, a steady thrum, 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 that anchors the sprawling chaos of the 160 rooms into a singular and focused intent. There are 13 hooks in the seance room where she allegedly hung her 13 different color robes and 13 stairs leading down into the quiet depths of the basement, where the air is thick with the scent of damp earth and old memories. She commissioned 13 light chandeliers that cast 13 shadows against the walls and 13 stones in the garden paths that lead toward the silent orchards where the trees stand in rows like sleeping soldiers. The number 13 becomes a boringly predictable element of the landscape, a rhythmic constant that allows the mind to stop searching for variety and instead settle into the comfort of the known. It is as if Sarah were counting her breaths to the architecture, using the wood and the glass to measure out a life lived in the presence of persistent mystery. The carpenters would measure and cut the boards in lengths that respected the 13-fold rule, their saws moving in a slow and steady back-and-forth motion that hummed with the frequency of a long and winding dream. You can feel the weight of this numerical obsession pressing down like a heavy velvet blanket as you imagine the thousands of instances where 13 appears in the hinges of doors and the slats of shutters and the panels of the walls. It is a boring and magnificent obsession that turns the house into a giant counting machine of plays where the logic of the number provides a shield against the unpredictability of the outside world. The shadows of the number 13 stretch across the redwood floors as the sun moves slowly across the sky, and you find yourself counting along with the house 1, 2, 3 until the repetition carries you toward the edge of a deep and dreamless sleep. There is no fear in the number here, only the quiet satisfaction of a pattern completed and a rhythm maintained throughout the decades of construction. The house breathes in 13ths and exhales in 13ths, and the air is filled with a soft and muffled sound of clock that only strikes 13 times before falling. Silent, you are drifting, now through a hallway with 13 doors and looking through a window with 13 lights as the heavy curtains of the night draw closed and the world fades into a singular and steady point of peace. The number is the key to the maze, and the maze is the key to the rest, and the rest is a long and silent journey into the dark where the only sound is a heartbeat, a house that never stops counting. Sleep now as the patterns merge and the numbers fade, and the only thing that remains is the slow and rhythmic pulse of the night. The seance room sits at the very heart of the labyrinth like a silent anchor in a sea of shifting redwood and shadows where the air is perfectly still and carries the faint sweet scent of old blue silk and guttering candles. Imagine a space so small and secluded that the world outside ceases to exist, and the only rhythm left is the slow and steady breathing of the house itself as the clock strikes the midnight hour, and Sarah Winchester moves toward this secret nerve center with the quiet grace of shadow drifting across a moonlit floor. She enters through a door that looks like any other, but leads into a chamber of profound and boring stillness where the walls are lined with 13 hooks for her 13 symbolic robes and the only light comes from the soft silver glow of the stars peeking through a single high window. There are no chairs for guests in this room, only the heavy presence of the unseen and the low muffled thud of the distant hammers that never stopped their rhythmic dance in the far wings of the mansion. She would sit in the center of the room, surrounded by the blue velvet that draped the walls like a soft midnight blanket, and wait for the whispers of the spirits to guide her hand as she sketched out new blueprints. For stairs that go nowhere and chimneys that end in closets. It was a boring and repetitive ritual of connection, a nightly meeting between the living and the dead that felt as natural and predictable as the turning of the tides or the falling of the autumn leaves. The room has 3 exits, but only one entrance, an architectural riddle designed to ensure that she could vanish into the maze of the house should the spirits grow too restless or the shadows grow too long. The silence here is a thick and heavy thing that settles over your shoulders like a warm cloak, lulling the senses into a state of deep and dreamless relaxation as you imagine scratching her pencil against the parchment paper, creating the map of a house that was never meant to be finished. The spirits were her silent architects, her invisible consultants in a project of grief and survival. And in this room, the boundaries between the physical world and the ethereal realm became as thin and soft as a spiderweb. The floorboards do not creak here because the room is held in a state of perpetual calm, a sanctuary of wood and spirit, where the logic of the day is replaced by the dreamscape of the night. Every midnight she would lock the door and find her peace in communication with the past, hearing the echoes of the repeating rifles transformed into the steady beat of construction and the promise of another day of life. It is a boringly beautiful cycle of creation where the seance room serves as the engine of the mansion, driving the saws and the hammers to create more space for memories to wander. The blue velvet absorbs all sound, leaving only the internal pulse of her own heart and the imagined voices of those who fell by the Winchester fortune, giving her the plans for rooms that would trap the confusion and houses the sorrow. You can feel yourself drifting deeper into the velvet shadows of the room as the candles flicker and fade, leaving only the rhythmic breathing of the house to guide you into a state of heavy and peaceful sleep. The room is a small box of quiet in a giant box of noise, and the two work together to create a harmony of the mundane and the mysterious that has no beginning and no end. The blueprints are drawn and the spirits are satisfied, and the night is a long and winding hallway that leads you toward the softest part of the dark. The seance room remains a silent witness to the woman who spoke to the wind and built a monument to the whispers of the dead, while the rest of the world slept in their simple houses with their straight lines and their finished walls. The velvet is soft and the air is cool, and the rest is just a steady and unchanging flow of a dream that builds itself one room at a time in the quietest part of your mind. The light is gone and the door is locked, and the house is breathing you into a deep and eternal rest. The great silence of the early morning hours on April 18, 1906, was suddenly broken by a low and guttural moan from the very bowels of the earth as the ground beneath the sprawling Winchester estate began to heave and roll like the surface of a dark and turbulent sea. Inside the mansion, the redwood timbers groaned, and the millions of panes of glass hummed with a frantic energy, while the ornaments of the Victorian era danced upon the shelves and the heavy chandeliers swung in wide and rhythmic arcs against the ornate ceilings. Sarah Winchester lay in her bed within the daisy bedroom, surrounded by the floral wallpaper and the quiet memories of 1,000 nights, when she was suddenly thrust into a chaotic and shifting reality as the chimney of her wing collapsed in a slow and heavy cascade of bricks and mortar. The earth shook with a boring and relentless power that seemed to go on forever, stretching seconds into minutes, while the architecture she had so carefully curated for decades began to twist and buckle under the weight of the spirit's anger. She found herself trapped within the small and dark confines of her room, the door jammed by the shifting of the house, and the air thick with the fine white dust of fallen plaster that settled over her like a ghostly shroud. She did not scream or panic, but rather lay in the stillness of the aftermath, listening to the house settle back into its foundations with a series of long and heavy sighs that echoed through the empty ballrooms and the winding hallways. To her, the earthquake was not a natural disaster of tectonic plates, but a profound and thunderous sign from the spirits that the construction had perhaps become too grand, or that she had focused too much on the beauty of the front of the house and not enough on the sanctuary of the back. As the sun began to rise over the dust-choked orchards, casting a hazy and golden light over the ruins of the 7-story tower, which had collapsed into a jagged mountain of timber, Sarah interpreted the destruction as a message to seal off the damaged rooms and move her focus once again into the labyrinth She believed the spirits had shaken the world to remind her of the fragility of her pact, and so she ordered the workmen to board up the grandest parts of the house, leaving the expensive Tiffany windows and the fine woodwork to sit in a boring and eternal darkness, while she retreated deeper into the interior maze. The sound of hammers resumed, but with a new and more urgent frequency, a rhythmic tapping that sought to repair the bridge between her world and the spectral realm that so violently asserted itself. The trapped hours in the Daisy bedroom became a sacred memory of a time when the house tried to swallow her whole, and the subsequent silence of the abandoned wings served as a comforting reminder that some things are meant to remain unfinished and untouched by the light of the day. The air in the sealed rooms grew stale and heavy with the scent of old wood and forgotten dreams, while the rest of the mansion continued its slow and steady growth in other directions, as if the earthquake had merely been a prune to the branches of a great and sprawling tree. She walked through the halls with a renewed sense of purpose, her black veils trailing behind her like a soft shadow, as she directed the carpenters to build around the ruins rather than clearing them away, creating a landscape of jagged edges and half-finished stories that reflected the fractured nature of her own soul. The earthquake was a turning point that solidified her resolve to never stop the hammers, because she saw the stillness of the earth as a threat and the movement of the saws as a prayer for continued existence. The house became a monument to survival after the shaking stopped a place where the broken parts were just as important as the new ones, and the memory of the trapped room was a sanctuary of quiet reflection in a world that was always moving and always changing. The night is long and the ground is now still, and the house breathes with a heavy and rhythmic pulse that tells the story of a woman who survived the earth's fury by building a maze that even the spirits could not break. The dust is settled, and the hammers are soft, and the rest is a deep and dreamless sleep within the heart of a house that knows how to stand its ground against the dark. Beyond the shadows of the ghost stories and the whispers of the supernatural, there lived a woman of profound intellect and quiet grace whose true legacy was written not just in the strange turns of her hallways, but in the kindness she showed to the hands that built them. Sarah Winchester was a brilliant mind of the arts and sciences, a woman who understood the tension of a spring and the chemistry of a garden, as well as she understood the sorrow of a grieving heart. She was a generous employer who paid her workmen double the going rate in the valley, ensuring that their families were fed and their homes were warm during the long winters when the orchards were bare and the air was thin. Imagine her moving through the house not as a frightened recluse, but as a master of engineering, her petite frame draped in black silk as she discussed the intricate mechanics of a new elevator or the complex plumbing of her indoor washrooms with precision that left the most seasoned craftsmen in awe. She was a patron of the beautiful and the useful, a woman who saw no conflict between the pursuit of the mystical and the application of the logical, as she designed innovative irrigation systems for her vast prune and apricot orchards that shimmered like a green sea around the mansion. The workers saw her as a steady and predictable force of benefactor who provided steady labor for 38 years without fail, creating a community within the construction site where the rhythmic sound of the hammers was the sound of a living wage and a stable life. She was deeply educated in music and spoke several languages fluently, often spending her quiet evenings playing a grand piano, while the sound of the keys blended with the soft tapping of the carpenters in the distant wings. Her eccentricity was perhaps merely a byproduct of an immense intelligence that found the standard architecture of the world too small and too simple for the complexity of her thoughts. She treated her domestic staff with a rare and heavy respect, leaving small gifts and ensuring their comfort in a way that was often overlooked by the sensationalist headlines of the day. The house was a laboratory where she experimented with light and sound, installing advanced heating systems and a complex network of speaking tubes that functioned like the nervous system of a great wooden giant. She was a woman who appreciated the grain of the redwood and the clarity of the Tiffany glass, not just as a shield against spirits, but as a celebration of human craftsmanship and the beauty of the natural world. In the quiet hours of the afternoon, she would walk through her gardens, inspecting the rare roses and the exotic plants she had imported from across the globe, her mind always turning toward the next project and the next innovation. She was a generous spirit who gave quietly to local charities and supported the arts in a way that left no footprint except in the lives of those she helped. The myth of the haunted widow is a thin veil that covers a much more interesting reality of a woman who took the immense wealth of the Winchester fortune and used it to create a world of perpetual motion and creative freedom, Her workers stayed with her for decades, bound by a sense of loyalty and the peaceful rhythm of a workplace where the boss was a silent but brilliant conductor of a never-ending symphony of progress. The air in her private library was thick with the scent of old leather and the ink of her. Many blueprints reflecting a life lived in the pursuit of knowledge and the solace of work. She was a scientist of the soul and an artist of the wood and the stone, a woman who built a labyrinth not just to hide but to house the vastness of her own curiosity. The repetitive nature of her construction was a manifestation of a mind that never wanted to stop learning and a heart that found peace in the steady flow of productive days. As you listen to the imagined sound of her piano music drifting through the halls, let the image of the frightening widow fade and replace it with the steady and comforting presence of a woman who is simply a master of her own world. The hammers are a heartbeat of industry, and the saws are the breath of innovation, and Sarah is at the center of it all, a calm and brilliant light in a house of 1,000 windows. The night is long and the story is peaceful, and the legacy of the woman is as solid and as enduring as the beams of the house she loved. The rest is a deep and respectful silence as the world outside fades away, and you drift into the quiet company of a brilliant mind at rest. The modern comforts of the Winchester estate began to weave themselves into the architecture like the silent silver threads of a mechanical dream, where Sarah's brilliant mind anticipated the needs of a future that the rest of the world had not yet imagined. As you wander through quiet hallways, you can feel the warmth rising from the floorboards because Sarah had designed an intricate system of heated floors that kept the chill of. The California nights at bay long before such luxuries were common in the valley. She was a woman who moved with the pulse of innovation, and her house was a living laboratory of Victorian technology that functioned with a boring and beautiful efficiency. Imagine the low and rhythmic hum of the 3 elevators she installed, including one that was a marvel of hydraulic engineering moving slowly and steadily between floors like a heavy breath being taken by the house itself. She did not believe in the limitations of her time, so she brought the future into her sanctuary, installing indoor plumbing that featured hot and cold running water and a complex system of drainage that allowed the house to function as a self-sustaining city of wood and steel. There were washrooms with porcelain sinks and showers that were years ahead of their time, where the water flowed in a steady and predictable stream that whispered of cleanliness and order amidst the growing labyrinth. She was obsessed with the movement of air and light, so she designed a network of speaking tubes that allowed her to communicate with her staff in distant wings without ever raising her voice or leaving the quiet of her seance room. The air was moved by advanced ventilation systems that kept the scent of fresh redwood and pine circulating through every corner, ensuring that the house never felt stagnant or heavy with the weight of its own secrets. She was a master of illumination, using the new power of electricity to light her halls with the soft and steady glow of early carbon filament bulbs, while also designing clever skylights and light wells that captured the sun and sent it deep into the interior of the mansion, where it would dance on the polished surfaces of the mahogany tables. There were even sophisticated fire alarm systems and a private gas plant that fueled the lights in the stoves, creating a sense of heavy security that allowed the house to operate as a world unto itself. The sheer ingenuity of these comforts was a boringly consistent theme in her life, where the complexity of the design was always balanced by the simplicity of the utility. She wanted her home to be a place of ease as well as a place of protection, so she utilized the latest inventions from the Industrial Revolution to make the life of a recluse as comfortable as that of a queen. The elevators would rise and fall with a slow and hypnotic vibration, their cables singing a low and metallic song that blended with the rhythmic tapping of the hammers in the distance. Every comfort was a layer of insulation between Sarah and the outside world, a mechanical barrier that allowed her to focus on the endless construction, while the house took care of itself with the steady grace of an automated giant. She saw the beauty in the valve and the pulley as much as she saw in the stained glass, and the carved were creating a harmony of the industrial and the aesthetic that defined the Winchester legacy. The heated floors were like the warm skin of the mansion, and the plumbing was its lifeblood, and the electricity was its nervous system, all working together in a silent and repetitive cycle that promised a future of peace and ease. As you imagine the warmth beneath your feet and the softening of the elevators and the walls, you can feel the weight of your own body settling into a deep and heavy state of rest, because the house is taking care of everything. There is no need to move or to think or to worry, because the machinery of the estate is always working for you in a boring and predictable rhythm that never fails and never changes. The lights are dimmed and the water is still, and the house is breathing with the quiet confidence of a masterwork of science and spirit. The night is long and the technology is soft, and the rest is just a long and winding journey into the heart of a dream where everything is provided for and everything is at peace. Sleep now as the elevators settle into their cradles and the heat fades into the wood and the house enters its final and most silent phase of the night. The end of the 38-year marathon arrived not with a thunderous crash or a final dramatic gesture, but with a quiet and heavy stillness that settled over the Santa Clara Valley on a cool September morning in 1922 as the life force of Sarah Winchester slowly ebbed away like a receding tide, leaving the great wooden leviathan of her mansion to catch its breath for the very first time. Imagine the sun rising over the fruit trees and casting its first golden rays upon the scaffolding that still clung to the side of the house like a skeletal embrace while the carpenters and the masons stood with their tools in hand, waiting for the signal to begin the day's rhythmic work. But the signal never came, and instead a profound and boring silence began to leak out from the master bedroom and flow through the 160 rooms, filling the hallways and the ballrooms with a weight that was more tangible than any brick or beam. For the first time in nearly 4 decades, the hammers did not fall, and the saws did not whine, and the rhythmic tapping that had been the heartbeat of the estate simply ceased, leaving a void in the air that was both unsettling and deeply peaceful. The workmen who had spent their entire adult lives in the service of a never-ending blueprint put down their mallets and their planes and walked toward the gates with a slow and measured gait, their boots crunching on the gravel in a steady cadence that was the only sound remaining in the morning air. The prophecy had reached its conclusion, and the debt to the spirits was finally considered paid as the woman who had outrun the shadows for so long finally closed her eyes and drifted into the same eternal stillness that now occupied her corridors. The house seemed to sigh and settle into the earth, its redwood frame no longer straining to grow or change, but simply existing in a state of heavy and permanent rest. The Tiffany glass windows held the light without flickering, and the doors that led to nowhere remained closed on their hinges, as if the labyrinth itself were holding its breath out of respect for the woman who had breathed life into its walls. The silence was a thick velvet blanket that muffled the sounds of the nearby orchards and the distant mountains, creating a sanctuary of total and absolute quiet, where even the dust motes seemed to move more slowly in the shafts of light. You can feel the absence of the noise like a physical presence, a cooling of the air, and a slowing of the pulse as the house transitions from a place of perpetual motion to a monument of static memory. There were no more blueprints to consult, and no more seances to attend, only the long and winding echoes of the past that whispered through the ventilation tubes and the empty elevator shafts. The tools were left where they lay coated in a fine layer of sawdust that looked like a light dusting of snow in the afternoon sun, and the unfinished rooms were left as they were half-framed, and open to the secrets of the dark. It was a boring and magnificent end to a story that many thought would never find its period, but now the ink was dry and the book was closed and the mansion was a silent sentinel overlooking the valley. The heavy draperies remained still, and the garden paths were empty, and the 13-hole drains were dry as the house began its long sleep alongside its creator. You could imagine yourself walking through this immediate silence, feeling the deep and heavy calm of a machine that has finally been turned off, and the relief of a heart that no longer needs to beat for 2 worlds at once. The night is now coming to this state, and for the first time in 38 years, there are no lanterns burning in the high towers, and no footsteps echoing in the secret passages, only the deep and rhythmic breathing of the night air as it moves through the open windows. The silence is a lullaby that carries you away from the work and the worry, and into a dream where the hammers are just a memory, and the house is a cradle of total peace. The marathon is over, and the rest is long, and the darkness is a kind and steady friend that covers a house and the valley in a blanket of eternal rest. Sleep now as the silence of the Winchester estate fills your mind, and the world becomes a place of soft shadows and finished stories. The transition to the great mansion from a private sanctuary of sorrow into a public monument of mystery began with a slow and steady change in the air as the gates that had been locked for 38 years swung open on their heavy iron hinges to reveal a world that the public had only ever seen in their most fevered dreams. Imagine the quiet house, sitting in the warm California sun, as the first curious visitors stepped onto the polished redwood. Floors, their voices hushed by the sheer scale of the labyrinth and the heavy weight of the silence that Sarah Winchester had left behind. The retreat of a grieving widow was now being measured and mapped by hands that did not know the touch of the hammer or the scent of the seance room, and the house began to take on a new life as a roadside attraction that captured the imagination of A, nation looking for a bridge to the supernatural. It was a boring and methodical process of turning a home into a museum where the winding hallways were roped off and the doors to nowhere were, highlighted by the flicker of electric lanterns to guide the way for thousands of seeking eyes. The story of the house drifted away from the technical brilliance of its plumbing and its elevators and toward the eerie folklore of the spirits that supposedly demanded a constant construction, creating a narrative that was as thick and sweet as the fruit in the surrounding orchards. The transition was a slow and rhythmic shift as the private grief of one woman became the public fascination of A. Millions strangers who walked the stairs to the ceiling and peered to the floor-level windows with a sense of wonder and a touch of delicious fear. The mansion was no longer a living, breathing organism of growth, but a frozen snapshot of a mind that had lived in a state of perpetual evening, and the world outside began to view the sprawling complex as a puzzle that could never be truly solved. Advertisements appeared in newspapers and on billboards across the country, turning the Winchester name into a symbol of the haunted and the bizarre as the house settled into its new role as a cornerstone of American curiosity. The silence of the 38-year marathon was replaced by the soft and repetitive shuffle of tourists' feet moving in a long and predictable line through the dining rooms and the bedrooms where Sarah once sought her quiet peace. The house grew old with a certain grace, its wood turning a deeper shade of amber and its glass reflecting the changing face of the valley. As the orchards were replaced by roads and the roads were replaced by a city that grew up around the mystery, it became a place of boringly consistent wonder where the legends were polished as bright as the brass fixtures and the ghost stories were told with a steady and rhythmic cadence by guides who knew every turn of the maze by heart. The mansion survived the passage of time by becoming a legend, a place where the logic of the everyday world was left at the front door and the logic of the dream took over for the duration of the tour. You can imagine yourself as one of those visitors drifting through the cool and shaded rooms, feeling the heavy presence of the history that soaks the walls like a slow-moving fog, and hearing the distant echo of the hammers that live only in the stories now. The transition was complete when the house became a landmark of the collective American imagination, a sanctuary for those who want to believe that the dead never truly leave and that a house can be built out of nothing but hope and sorrow and infinite wealth. The night settles over grand gables and the towers of the attraction, and the gift shops close their doors, leaving the mansion to return to an original state of quiet reflection under the watchful eye of the moon. The house is a bridge between the reality of the widow and the myth of the ghost, and as you drift towards sleep, you can feel the house standing tall and silent in the dark, a monument to the endurance of a story that refuses to die. The tour is over and the lights are low, and the long and winding hallway of the night is leading you toward a place of total and absolute stillness, where the only thing that matters is the steady rhythm of your own breath and the heavy comfort of a sleep that lasts as long as the labyrinth itself. The final reflection begins to settle over the sprawling estate like a soft and heavy mist that blurs the lines between the jagged edges of folklore and the smooth surfaces of historical reality, inviting a deep and steady calm to descend upon the mind as we contemplate the true nature of Sarah Winchester and her house of 1,000 secrets. As the night reaches its deepest point and the air in the Santa Clara Valley grows cool, and still we find ourselves standing at the crossroads of two different stories, one made of spiritualist shadows and the other made of human ingenuity and a restless creative spirit that possessed the infinite resources to turn every whim into a reality of redwood and stone. Imagine the house not as a dark and confusing spirit trap designed to ensnare the restless ghosts of the past, but rather as the lifelong project of a woman who was a brilliant architect of her own solitude, using the rhythmic falling of the hammers to drown out the silence of a world that had taken everyone she loved. It is a boring and beautiful possibility that the stairs to the ceiling and the doors to the abyss were not mystical puzzles, but simply the artistic experiments of a mind that had no need to follow the rules of society she had long since left behind. Perhaps she was merely a woman with an immense curiosity for mechanics of the world, a patron of the arts and sciences, who saw her home as an ever-evolving canvas where she could play with light and space and the new technologies of the industrial age without ever reaching a final and stagnant conclusion. The myth of the haunted widow is a soft and rhythmic lullaby that we tell ourselves to explain the unexplainable, but the reality of the independent and wealthy inventor is a story of quiet power and steady determination that feels as solid as the foundation of the house itself. As you drift through the imagined hallways of your own thoughts, let the idea of the spirits fade into the background like a distant and muffled echo replaced by the steady and comforting image of a woman who found her peace in the constant motion of a building site and the sweet scent of fresh sawdust. The house is a monument to the endurance of the human spirit and the way we create our own sanctuaries in the wake of tragedy, building layers of complexity to protect the simple and fragile heart that beats at the center of the maze. It doesn't matter if the house was built for the dead or for the living, because the result is the same: a sanctuary of quiet wonder where the rules of the world are suspended, and the only thing that remains is the long and winding journey toward the quietest part of the night. The legend and the history merge into a singular and peaceful stream of thought that flows toward a horizon of total and absolute rest where the hammers are silent and the blueprints are folded and the woman in black is finally a home in the stillness she created. The house is just a house, and the story is just a story, and the truth is a heavy and warm blanket that covers them both in a layer of eternal peace. The stars are bright above the high towers, and the orchards are dreaming of the spring, and the labyrinth is a cradle that holds the secrets of a life well lived and a world well built. You can feel the weight of the story lifting away, leaving only the rhythmic and predictable sound of your own breath as you enter the final room of the mansion, where the light is soft and the bed is. Waiting in the rest is a deep and dreamless sleep that lasts until the sun rises over the mountains to find the house exactly as it was meant to be, silent and still and perfect in its mystery.